May 8, 1945. The guns go silent across a continent that has spent 6 years eating itself alive. 50 million people are dead. Entire cities have been reduced to ash and rubble. The most technologically advanced civilization in human history has just finished committing the most industrially systematic genocide the world has ever seen. And on that specific morning, that precise, documented, historically fixed morning, the Third Reich surrenders unconditionally to the Allied powers. The war in Europe is over. The world the viewer inhabits begins right there, in that moment. That particular silence, that particular morning, now. What if that morning never came? What if, instead of surrender, the Third Reich held? What if the Allies, already exhausted, already hemorrhaging men and materiel across 2 massive theaters of war, failed to close the vice? What if the decisions made in a handful of critical months between 1942 and 1944 had gone differently, and Nazi Germany consolidated its hold over the European continent, established a cold armed standoff with a wary United States, and built the kind of permanent institutional horror that its architects had always imagined? Think about that. Not as a Hollywood fantasy, not as pulp fiction, but as a genuine, historically grounded question about how the world you were born into actually came to exist, and how easily, how terrifyingly easily, it almost didn't. Because here's the thing, the Allied victory was not inevitable. The historians who have studied this most rigorously are the clearest on that point. Richard Overy, whose work on the economics of the Second World War remains foundational, argued explicitly in Why the Allies Won that the margin between Allied victory and strategic stalemate was genuinely narrow in at least 3 distinct phases of the war. The petroleum crisis of 1944, the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic, the industrial mobilization race, each of these could have tilted. And if even one of them had tilted the other way, the calculus changes dramatically. So let's follow it. Let's go where the evidence and the modeling and the historical record actually lead, and see what world we find when we get there. The most plausible divergence point sits in late 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad, which runs from August 1942 to February 1943 and kills somewhere between 750,000 and 850,000 Axis soldiers, depending on the estimate, in roughly 200 days of some of the most savage urban combat in recorded military history, is the moment the Eastern Front turns permanently against Germany. That's the equivalent of losing the entire population of present-day San Francisco and Seattle combined in a single winter. Gone. Because of decisions made in a handful of command rooms. If the German Sixth Army breaks out of the Stalingrad encirclement in November 1942, a scenario that multiple military historians, including David Glantz in his exhaustive reconstruction of the campaign, have assessed as operationally plausible if Hitler had overridden his own order to hold, the Eastern Front stabilizes. Germany doesn't win in the East, but it doesn't catastrophically collapse there either. And that single change rewrites everything that follows. With a stabilized Eastern Front, Germany in 1943 is a fundamentally different strategic animal. Its armored divisions are not destroyed. Its experienced officer corps is not gutted. Its fuel reserves, which by 1944 had fallen to genuinely catastrophic levels, a collapse documented in detail by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey published in 1945, are not yet in terminal decline. The Reich can defend. And defense in a world where the United States is also fighting Japan is enough. Here's where it gets strange. Because the United States in this alternate timeline faces a genuine strategic dilemma that has no clean answer. The war in the Pacific is consuming enormous resources. Japan controls a vast network of island fortifications. The atomic program, the Manhattan Project, is not completed until July 1945, and even then its initial application is against Japan, not Europe. An American amphibious invasion of a militarily intact Nazi-controlled Europe is not the confident Normandy landing of actual history. It is a prospective catastrophe. American military planners in the real timeline were already deeply anxious about Overlord's chances. With a Germany that has not been bled white on the Eastern Front, the anxiety becomes something much closer to paralysis. And this is where the modeling from political scientists who have studied this counterfactual, including work published by Randall Schweller in his analysis of great power competition and war termination, suggests something deeply counterintuitive. The most likely outcome in this scenario is not American invasion and eventual Allied victory. It is negotiated stalemate, a cold armed standoff across the Atlantic and the English Channel, with a Nazi-controlled continental Europe on one side and a nuclear-armed democratic alliance on the other. Think about that for a moment. Really sit with it. Because what that means is not Germany winning a war. It means Germany winning a peace. A peace where the Third Reich has enough time, enough resources, and enough internal cohesion to begin building the permanent institutional structures its architects had always envisioned. And this is the part that the historical record, particularly the documentation recovered from the Wannsee Conference of January 1942 and the detailed administrative planning studies compiled by the Reich Security Main Office, makes genuinely and permanently disturbing. The Holocaust in the actual historical timeline murdered approximately 6 million Jews and 5 to 6 million additional people, disabled individuals, political prisoners, Roma, Soviet POWs, gay men, before the Allied advance began destroying the infrastructure of mass killing. The apparatus was still operating in early 1945. It was stopped by military force, not internal collapse. In an alternate timeline where that military force never arrives, where the Reich instead consolidates into a permanent state, demographic modeling published by historian Götz Ali in Hitler's Beneficiaries and extended by subsequent researchers suggests the death toll does not plateau, it accelerates. The General Plan Ost, the documented Nazi planning document for the ethnic reorganization of Eastern Europe through deportation, starvation, and systematic murder of approximately 30 to 45 million Slavic people over roughly 20 years, moves from planning document to active implementation. Just to be clear about the timescale here, 20 years is less than a single human generation, which means the adults living in Eastern Europe in 1943 would still be alive to watch it happen to their children. This is the part that gets me every single time I go back to the research. Because we are not talking about a theoretical horror. We are talking about documented institutional planning that was actively underway and was stopped by specific military events in a specific sequence that almost did not happen. If this is already making you rethink everything you assumed about how the world you live in actually came to exist, subscribe. Because we go exactly this deep every single week into the history and science and mathematics that made the present possible. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. Every video in this series takes you somewhere the textbooks don't. Now, what does the rest of this alternate world actually look like? Because the geopolitical picture is only the beginning of the divergence. The deeper you go into the research, the more the implications multiply. Look at what the Reich's economic structure would have required for long-term stability. The Nazi war economy, documented in extraordinary detail by Adam Tooze in The Wages of Destruction, still the definitive economic history of the Third Reich, was structurally dependent on continuous expansion and continuous plunder. The regime financed its military buildup through a combination of deficit spending, asset seizure from Jewish and politically persecuted populations, and the systematic economic exploitation of occupied territories. By 1944, in the actual timeline, this model was already in visible distress. In an alternate timeline of stable post-war existence, the Reich faces a genuine economic reckoning. And here's what the research actually shows. The most likely resolution to that reckoning is a kind of permanent extraction empire, where the occupied eastern territories are administered as economic colonies, supplying raw materials and forced labor to a German metropolitan core. This is not speculation. This is the documented policy intention of the Reich's planning agencies, extended forward in time. Economic historian Mark Mazauer, in Hitler's Empire, details the administrative frameworks the Nazis had already built across occupied Europe for exactly this purpose. They were not improvising. They had institutional blueprints. In a world where they have the time to implement them fully, you get something that looks less like Nazi Germany and more like a vast, racially stratified continental empire. With a bureaucratic permanence that historical analogies suggest would have been genuinely difficult to dismantle from within. The technological trajectory in this alternate world is also deeply strange to map, because the Reich was genuinely producing remarkable science in specific domains: rocket technology, jet propulsion, certain areas of nuclear and chemical research, while simultaneously destroying the scientific community that could have taken those technologies further. The mass exodus of Jewish and politically targeted scientists from Germany between 1933 and 1941, a diaspora that brought Albert Einstein, Edward Teller, Enrico Fermi, John von Neumann, and Leo Szilard to the United States, directly built the Manhattan Project. In a world where these scientists never flee to America, or where America never brings its full industrial weight to bear on nuclear development, the atomic timeline shifts. The United States still develops the bomb, eventually, but the margin may be narrower than it looks, and a Reich that has captured the full scientific infrastructure of continental Europe, including the French, Czech, Norwegian, and Dutch scientific establishments, is not scientifically helpless. The V-2 rocket program, already operational in 1944, continues to advance. The Me-262 jet fighter, already in combat, is produced at full industrial scale. German nuclear research, which the actual historical record shows was further along than post-war mythology suggested, work documented in Jeremy Bernstein's study of the farm hall transcripts, accelerates without the constant Allied bombing disruption. You get, in other words, a technological Cold War, not between democracy and communism as actually happened, between democracy and fascism. With nuclear weapons on both sides and with the ideological stakes even higher than the actual Cold War carried, because the alternative to democratic victory is not simply a different economic system. It is the permanent institutional architecture of racial extermination. And this is where the cultural picture becomes almost impossible to fully inhabit. Because the world the viewer was born into, the post-1945 world of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions as actually enforced, the Nuremberg Trials establishing individual criminal accountability for state-sponsored mass murder, the decolonization movements that swept Asia and Africa, the civil rights movements that transformed the democracies. None of that happens on the same timeline or in the same form, in an alternate world where fascism wins its peace in Europe. The Nuremberg Trials, which established for the first time in international law that following orders is not a legal defense for crimes against humanity, happened specifically because the Allies win, and specifically because they choose to prosecute rather than simply execute. That precedent reshapes international law for the next 8 decades. In a world where there is no Allied victory in Europe, there are no Nuremberg trials. The precedent is never set. International humanitarian law develops along an entirely different trajectory, if it develops at all. The decolonization movements of the 1950s and 1960s drew direct ideological force from Allied war rhetoric, from the Atlantic Charter's promise of self-determination, from the moral delegitimization of racial hierarchy that the exposure of Nazi crimes accelerated. In an alternate timeline where the Reich survives, where racial hierarchy is institutionalized and functioning as a continental system of governance, the moral delegitimization of European colonialism is enormously delayed. The empires last longer. The independence movements are weaker. The global South develops on a different, slower, more violently constrained timeline. The civil rights movement in the United States, which drew crucial momentum from the specific moral contradiction of Black American soldiers fighting a war against racial ideology abroad while facing racial segregation at home. That specific contradiction becomes murkier in a world where the United States never fights that war to a democratic conclusion. The pressure is different. The timeline is different. The outcome is not necessarily worse in every respect, but it is different in ways that cascade through the entire second half of the 20th century in ways that are genuinely impossible to fully map. Stay with me, because this is where it gets philosophically uncomfortable in a way I find genuinely difficult to set aside. The world you were born into required a very specific chain of events. It required that the German Sixth Army not break out at Stalingrad. It required that the D-Day landings at Normandy succeed. And historian Antony Beevor has documented in granular detail how close they came to potential catastrophe in the first hours of June 6, 1944. It required that the Allied industrial mobilization outpace the German one by a margin large enough to matter. It required that the specific human beings who made specific decisions in specific rooms made the decisions they made, and not the alternatives that were available to them. The liberation of the death camps. Auschwitz, liberated by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945. Buchenwald by American forces on April 11, 1945. Bergen-Belsen by British forces on April 15, 1945, required all of it, every link in the chain. And I cannot stress this enough. The world that emerged from those specific events is not the inevitable world. It is the world that survived. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and once you feel it, I do not think you can easily unfeel it. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in December 1948. The European Project, the coal and steel community, eventually the European Union, built explicitly to make another European war structurally impossible by entangling the economies of former enemies. The International Criminal Court System, the NATO alliance, the post-war economic boom that lifted living standards across the Western world to levels that would have been inconceivable to previous generations. The scientific revolution in medicine, computing, and communication that the post-war world produced at an astonishing rate, partly because the global scientific community had been reconstructed around democratic institutions that allowed free exchange of knowledge. All of it is downstream of a specific Allied military victory in a specific war, won by specific margins, in specific months, by specific human beings, making specific decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty. The world that exists in the alternate timeline, the one where Nazi Germany achieves its permanent peace, is a world of permanent ideological Cold War, of continental racial empire, of delayed decolonization, of international law without the Nuremberg precedent, of scientific progress entangled with an institutional horror that has now acquired the permanence of a state. It is not a world that collapses quickly if the historical record on durable authoritarian systems is any guide. Research on authoritarian state longevity, including work by political scientist Barbara Geddes on regime durability, consistently shows that ideologically coherent single-party states with strong institutional infrastructure and external threat framing, exactly what the Reich in its stable post-war form would have, survive for decades, sometimes for generations. You, right now, reading this, you exist in a world where that alternate trajectory was foreclosed, where the specific chain of events went the other way, where the gun stopped on May 8, 1945, and not because it was inevitable, and not because the good guys always win, but because a genuinely fragile sequence of contingent events produced a specific outcome that then produced the world you were born into, as if it were natural, as if it were predetermined, as if it could not have been otherwise. It could have been otherwise. That is what the research actually shows. That is what the documents confirm. That is what the modeling suggests. And living with that awareness, really living with it, not as an abstract intellectual exercise, but as a felt understanding of where the present actually comes from, changes how you understand everything about the world you inhabit. Before we close this out, drop a comment and tell me which part of this changed how you think about the question of what the present actually required. Was it the Stalingrad divergence? The demographic modeling? The Nuremberg precedent? The way the civil rights timeline shifts? Tell me below, because I read every comment and this is exactly the kind of thing I want to think through together. And if this video did what I hoped it would do, if you finish it feeling genuinely different about the contingency of the world you live in, subscribe. Like the video so the algorithm shows it to someone else who needs to feel this. Share it with someone who thinks the good guys always win, who thinks history was always going to go the way it went. Because it wasn't. And knowing that, really knowing it, matters more than almost anything else you can carry with you into the world. New videos every week. We go this deep every time. I'll see you in the next one.